good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, for another episode of HSEQ Leaders podcast. I'm with Charlotte Ingham from Psychosocial Leadership. That's correct, right? Psychosocial
That is correct.
Leadership.
Psychosocial Leadership.
G'day, Charlotte. How are we going?
Yeah, I'm great, John. I'm good.
Well, you are currently, so you're a Perth person. You're currently in Melbourne for the day.
Yes.
For AIHS, but fill us in and fill the listeners in a bit about yourself, Charlotte.
So originally I was a school teacher, actually. I had a particular interest in kids with ADHD and, divergent ways of thinking. And I ended up studying brain chemistry at Murdoch Uni. So I did a Masters of Educational Research looking at all these different brain chemicals and how we learn and how brain chemistry impacts our behaviour and our decisions and how we communicate. And without me really intending, that pivoted me into a career into teaching wellbeing in the workplace. So workplaces would be having kind of mental health crisis, like things would be going wrong, and they'd say, Charlotte, can you come in? Can you teach resilience, for example? Can you teach people how to reduce their stress levels? So I would come in and talk about cortisol, the chemical of stress. How do we get that down? Serotonin, one of the big chemicals of resilience. How do we get that up in natural ways? And I ended up teaching emotional intelligence in prisons for 10 years, which was pretty interesting, very cool, working with people whose brain chemistry might be all over the place from addiction issues and things like that, and then helping them get their nervous system into the optimum state for the task at hand, which was essentially the same thing I was doing with workers and CEOs and managers. And how can this kind of question, if a manager can learn how to hack into their own brain chemistry and bring themselves into this state of calm alert, like with a level of confidence and direction and a sense of oxytocin, like empathy and connection to the team, leaders that can do that are just incredible, right? We just love leaders like that because of what we feel in ourselves when they're leading the team well. So that was really exciting, and I really enjoyed that. And however, as the years progressed, I was noticing it's teaching resilience, yes, so important. Teaching stress management, yes, so important. But organisations were not necessarily taking care of the psychological safety in the organisation, or they're exposing workers to like unrealistic work demands, or things are going on. And then they were saying, Charlotte, they're not coping. Can you come in and teach them how to cope? Can you teach them how to get their stress levels down? I'd kind of come in and, have a go. And it was great. And I'm still a big believer in that part of the puzzle. The clincher was probably 2020 when Rio Tinto blew up Jucan Gorge up north in WA. And that triggered, they blew up a sacred site, triggered a pretty massive mental health crisis in two of the big teams up there, over which half were Indigenous. And they kind of got blamed for the process that led to the caves getting blown up. And then they said, Charlotte, can you come in and teach them how to cope and teach them how to be resilient and how not to stress? And I kind of went, okay. So I came in and I did loads of workshops up north, and it was great and I loved it. But it was just this feeling of going, hang on a second, like what's the responsibility of the organisation to not create conditions which trigger a really shit brain chemistry in us human beings? So I started going, it's not just about the individual, it's about the conditions in which they work, and the organisation has a responsibility to manage those conditions. So at that point, I had not heard the word psychosocial. That was 2020. And it was actually 2021. My dad, who is an old WHS manager from years back, came across the ISO standard 45003, and he was reading it and he rang me and he was like, Charlotte, what is this word, like psychosocial? He said, it sounds like it's what you do. And so he sent me the code of practice and I went through it and I went, hang on, this is what I do. This is actually really important because it's saying the organisation has a responsibility to minimise the impact or eliminate some of them so that workers aren't exposed to these things. I kind of went, wow, like if an organization does that well, if an organization manages all of those hazards, then this piece about resilience and stress management, we will just be able to go so far in terms of creating optimum brain chemistry in ourselves and getting us into that state where we want to be productive, we want to solve problems, we want to face challenges, we want to work together in groups and get things done. We as human beings, when we're healthy, want to be productive. It's part of our DNA. And I just went, yes, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. It's that cultural shift. It's like collective common sense around the responsibilities the organization has in managing conditions which allow us to create optimum mental health. So that was really exciting. So I went out and got my Cert 4 in WHS, and here I am at the WHS show in Melbourne 2024. So
There you go. Look at that.
yeah.
That is a really concise introduction. I wish I need to work on my elevator pitch to make it that concise. Yeah.
That was just me telling stories about my dad.
So talk me around then, I guess, two things. First of all, how can businesses elevate that psychosocial safety at present?
Yeah.
Who's doing it well?
Yeah. Who's doing it well, did you say?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
It's a double-ended question there, sorry.
Yeah. I guess, again, I'll talk about my journey and then kind of say why it's the wrong way around.
Cool.
So because traditionally I'm a trainer and a teacher and I just love going into rooms and working with people and teaching them, that has been most of what I've done over the last 5 years. So I've kind of gone in, a lot of organizations have engaged me at that level. So I come in and I talk about psychosocial hazard management. I've chopped up the code of practice and made it into a puzzle and laminated it, and everyone has to match the descriptions and the examples and controls. And I talk about all the legal compliance stuff. I talk about how it connects to the Respect at Work Amendment and the positive duty that uses very similar language to the WHS. And then hone in on, I was trying to work out, well, what are their main psychosocial hazards? Is it burnout? Is it unrealistic work demands? The science around burnout is just so fascinating in and of itself. Huberman talks a lot about burnout and dopamine and what happens when we're burning through adrenaline, what it does to our dopamine system. And so I'm really into the science of fatigue and burnout, often connected to unrealistic work demands or trauma. So I'd sort of try and work out what the psychosocial hazards are, pick the top 3, and then do a workshop on those 3 psychosocial hazards, plus the overarching responsibilities around the WHS process, which was awesome. But then I went, hang on a second, how about if we start at the beginning and we do identify hazards first? So now what I try and recommend is I come in and I do a psychosocial hazard gap analysis first. So I come in and essentially I'm going through the organization, like actually physically walking around and talking to people and going through their documents and their procedures and getting them to do the people at work survey and doing consultation meetings with managers and with non-managers, and what wakes you up at 2 a.m. What is it about work that stresses you out, and just chucking it all on post-it notes and essentially gathering a whole stack of data. And why people leave organizations, there's often a lot of gems, for want of a better word, in there in terms of clues as to the invisible psychosocial hazards that are lurking. And it's very much, physical hazards, we can see them, right? You go, oh, there's a slip hazard, or there's a trip hazard, or that person's not wearing their hard hat. It's like you can see it. Whereas psychosocial hazards, it's like they're little gremlins that are kind of invisible. And they hide not in people, but kind of in between us and in the work design. And it's kind of a different vision required.
It's intangible, right?
Yeah. So how do we perceive that? And I kind of feel like I go in there and I grab these little gremlins by the scruff of their neck and like pull them into the light. And then we go, okay, now we can all see them. So that's your psychosocial hazard gap analysis report, where you go, these are the things that are going on that are having a negative impact potentially on people's mental health, reducing productivity, increasing absenteeism, increasing high turnover rates. So once we get them into the light, I go, yeah, okay, tick, identify the hazards. And then we go into that risk assessment process of working out what's the impact, what's the how are we going to risk manage these, and then ideally, usually the training is already happening at about that point as a control, and then I come in with the training. So I really like it if I've done the gap analysis first, because then I know exactly what I'm speaking to in the training room. I know where the gremlins are and what they look like, and then we target the training at that. And then the people, they just have those moments like, yes, that's what burnout is. Oh yeah, I'm actually like 4 months into the 9-month burnout journey. So what can I do now to improve my brain chemistry, to change the way my work is structured? What type of conversations? So we do a lot of I do conversation maps for managers, how to have a conversation as a manager if you think a worker is going into burnout, or if you're a worker and you want to have that conversation with your manager. Or I'm doing quite a bit at the moment with DFS and the trauma they're exposed to and the impact that can potentially have. There's some research. I just came across this research just last week, John. And if it's all right, I just want to talk about it. It's the suicide rates in New Zealand. So just a trigger warning, we're just going to talk about the stats around suicide. And the New Zealand, is it WorkSafe, their version of WorkSafe in New Zealand, just did a big study into the causal effects of suicide in New Zealand. And they found that 12% of suicides in New Zealand last year were the result of unmanaged psychosocial hazards.
Really?
So 12%, yeah. So for New Zealand, that came out at 70 people last year. So I then went, okay, wow, that's interesting. So if we take, if we come across the Tasman Sea and apply that to Australia, and I got my calculator out and I did some research on how many people in Australia took their own lives
by the
last
same
year.
ratio, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it was 3,300. And then I did 12% of that, and it came to 396 people. I went, okay. And then I went, how many people lost their lives due to physical health and safety hazards in Australia last year? And it was 197 people.
Wow.
And I went, shit, unmanaged psychosocial hazards are our most deadly safety issue that we have in Australia right now. So if we can get better at managing psychosocial hazards, like there's just huge potential there, huge opportunity. Yeah. If managers can get good at it, if organisations can get good at it. So
sorry, on that fact as well, that's actually genuinely really blown my mind, right? Because on that fact as well, you could also have psychosocial might not be the main causal factor, but a secondary causal factor, right? Compared to everything else, right? Because we know with stress, humans are pretty resilient if stress is coming from a singular point. It's when it's multiple points, right? That you really get that breakdown. So that is a real incredible number. I mean, even as a rough number, right? It brings a very valid point.
Yeah. It was certainly pretty sobering.
So how do we get better? How do we do this number, Charlotte?
Well, I suppose for me, I mean,
other than speaking to you, of course,
Yeah. Well, it was, I remember when I was 12 years old, and back in would have been the early 90s. Very innocent upbringing I had back then. There was no internet. I only ever watched PG-rated movies, and I had never heard of suicide. Right, I had no idea that it was a thing that human beings could do. So I would have been about 11 at this point. And then someone, friends of the family, that happened, and I just remember being absolutely blown away, going, "What? Like what goes on?" And asking the question how that could happen as an 11-year-old. The person who'd taken their own life was 18, and being told they had a chemical imbalance in their brain. And I just remember feeling deeply curious as to what the heck that meant. Like, do I have chemicals in my brain? Like, does my mum have chemicals in my brain? Like, what the heck are these things that are so powerful? So that was really what triggered the curiosity into brain chemistry. So then kind of skip, 20 years ahead, and then I'm studying brain chemistry at Murdoch going, these are those chemicals. And we all have them, like serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, cortisol. They're going up and down all the time. So from a personal level, and it's in the WHS Act, like it says, workers, we have a responsibility to take reasonable steps to look after ourselves at work, including our psychosocial safety. But so many workers, we don't know when we're stressed. I reckon at least 50% of people in WA don't know when they're stressed. So their heart rate's gone up a little bit. They're getting a bit tense. They may be a bit headachy. They're getting these physiological signs they just kind of ignore. And they don't realize that they're stressed, and they just kind of stay stressed day after day, week after week. And that's not good for us. That's not good for us physically. It's not good for us mentally. So I'm kind of like, okay, WorkSafe, you've said we have a responsibility to look after our own health and safety, but I don't think we know how to do that. So a big part of it is learning to be self-aware of when we are stressed. So what those physical symptoms are. And then we can come in with all the strategies. Okay, what do we do if we've got tension and if our breathing has shifted? And the Australian Defence Force recently has introduced a policy where people in the Defence Force are supposed to be aware of their physical stress levels, like heart rate, breathing, tension. And if they notice that their cortisol levels are going up, then there's a very specific breathing technique. A lot of research has been done into this one. And they have to inhale. And then at the top of the inhalation, there's a gasp, hold, and then exhale. And they have to do that 3 times, right? But I just do it once and I'm like, right, I can feel my cortisol levels come down. So there's things like that. It's like, what do we do in the moment when we're getting stressed? And another one that also just came out, it was this whole thing around, are we allowed to shout at each other at work, right? Someone's frustrated, someone's angry, there's a manager under pressure, people in the team not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and then they shout. And a lot of organizations I'm working with, this is an issue, and we're kind of going, is that okay? Is that bullying? Like, when does it cross over? And a case just came through. It was in New South Wales, I think. I just posted it on my LinkedIn, and it was the person had claimed their manager was bullying them and was shouting at them. And the courts actually said the manager raised their voice twice, but it wasn't enough to be considered yelling. And so it wasn't bullying because there wasn't enough to show there was a negative impact. There was a risk to harm for that person, which I was like, oh, that's interesting, because there's a whole stack of people I'm working with saying, yeah, we shout at each other all the time, like the manager's under pressure. So essentially it sounds like you can I'm talking about legal, right? You've also got your code of conduct and you've got your personal standards. Like, I'm not recommending it, but when does the behavior become unlawful? Well, there's a difference between shouting and yelling. I'm not quite sure what that difference is. I do.
It must be a decibel. There must be.
I know.
There has to be a decibel somewhere, right?
I'm waiting for that. It's like, because my 14-year-old son, right, very passionate communicator, and I would say to him, stop shouting at me, and he will yell back, I am not shouting, you have sensitive ears. And it's like, oh, okay, like, what is the level? I don't know, but definitely not swearing whilst the voice is raised, and definitely no insults. So that seems to be what this court case was like. There was no swearing, there's no insults. The person they were underperformance managing a person. There was a few behavioural issues, and the person wasn't responding to the underperformance management, and the manager shouted but didn't yell. So I went, okay, well, there's I guess a line in the sand. But a big
something for us,
part of
I guess this segues a lot nicely to sort of one of my ending points. I mean, where do you see this going? I mean, I don't think, that's a perfect example. 10 years ago, I don't think anyone would have been put into court for shouting at an employee. Now, for right or for wrong, right? Where do you see this? I mean, there's so much. It'd be talked about, I imagine, in Melbourne extensively today, psychosocial. And I don't think anyone really knows, but you're at the closest, you're at the coalface here, Charlotte. Where do you see this going in the next 5 years? and the impact there?
I just think it's like it's been in really low pixelation, and now it's coming into high resolution.
Yeah,
So
we've
we're
got
going,
the
oh, okay.
4K TV has just been released, right?
Yeah. So we're just seeing things a bit clearer. I think we're going in a good direction, John. I honestly do. I think there's going to be issues. I think there's a potential for people to weaponize this, workers to say, high work demands, I can't do that in an 8-hour shift. And then you go, well, you probably could if you just didn't have quite so many smokos, or, or, my boss is bullying me. Well, underperformance management is not bullying if it's done properly. So I think it's some of that. And a lot of what I do when I'm teaching managers, it's like how to call out inappropriate behavior without bullying somebody, how to underperformance manage someone without bullying. It's like how to do things professionally and reasonably, but still giving really great feedback, because we all need feedback. And I think it's that with workers, it's changing that mindset to, when your manager is giving you feedback, take that as the wind in your sails, right? Like, this is your mentor helping you become great at your job. That's a very different nervous system response to, I'm getting told off, or, someone's essentially trying to drop my serotonin levels by making me feel incompetent. So if we're running that script when we get negative feedback, it is going to have a negative impact on our mental health. But if we can rewrite that script to say, this is my mentor caring about me, boom, serotonin goes up, oxytocin goes up. So I think it's some of that. It's a lot of EI, emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I think that's for every industry, but especially safety, right? Emotional intelligence is key. Charlotte, you've jumped on today and took time out, being on the other side of the country when we're usually down the road from each other. Thank you so much. I think of your, when we've spoken as well, your perspective is very different to what a lot of people hear every day, and knowledge is incredibly important. I think a lot of listeners and safety professionals, both in WA and on the East Coast, really would appreciate your insight. So I'll leave your show notes or your links in the notes. But thank you so much for jumping on, and it's a very refreshing special edition episode, I guess.
Hey, great. Thank you, John. That was fantastic.
Thanks again, Charlotte, and we'll talk soon.
Cheers. Thanks, John.